I'm Art Harris in New Orleans at the world's largest gathering of astrologers. This is the center of the universe at the moment, and I'm here speaking with a couple of the stars of the superstars. The gentleman here is well known among the stars of Hollywood. You have been praised by Robert Downey Jr., Oprah's magazine, and even the author of the screenplay of Thelma and Louise. Why do so many superstars, and I'm sure other lesser stars, call you a wise man who calls it out just right?
I think for the same reason that single mothers of 3 who are waitresses in Chicago would consult me, which is just help with the endless process of being human. People at every level of the social food chain, will face basically the same issues in their lives, the questions of intimacy and the raising of children, and so I help anybody who comes to me.
But the name Steve Forrest, at least in the astrology world, I mean, you are the teacher of teachers, from what I understand.
Yes, I have a large apprenticeship program. It's 700 people or so have studied with me in that way.
And what is it? Why is astrology? Do you think it's having a renaissance?
I absolutely do. I think that the big picture is that the ancient traditions of astrology collided with the relatively newcomer traditions of psychology, starting maybe 100 years ago. And the Renaissance, its roots are really in that fusion of psychology and astrology. It's matured both of them.
Do you find there's less skepticism about what you do in California than elsewhere?
Well, I lived in North Carolina for 40 years, and there's definitely less skepticism. But I would also quickly say that people will often assume that anyone who goes to an astrologer would be able to sing Beatles tunes and eat a lot of granola, so to speak. There are cultural assumptions that are completely incorrect. I'd probably underscore the most obvious illustration that Ronald Reagan was an avid fan of astrology. Socially conservative people are quite open to it too, in my experience.
Well, today I've met people who have advised corporations and called the Facebook IPO out, and it's fascinating. And I have confessed that I have used an astrologer.
Thank you.
To pick the day of my wedding. Actually, it was my wife's astrologer, David Rayleigh.
Yes,
and 12 years later, we're still married. So, I said, David, proof is in the pudding.
Yes.
But tell me, now, Lynn, you were based in Paris. So do you do charts in French?
I do, yeah. I've lived in France. I grew up in Chicago. And I moved to France in my 20s. And I've lived there actually longer than here. But I'm mobile. I teach in England. I come to the States and teach. And so I go back and forth. But my French friends say when I've been in the States for a while that my accent gets really terrible for about a week. So I advise my clients to wait.
What is your style? You're also a therapist or not?
No, I have therapeutic training. I was trained in Ericksonian hypnosis, and one of the things I love about that is that it teaches you how profound the words you use reach deeply into another person's hearing. And people will often say, "You said to me," and in France they use this very old-fashioned language. They say, "Lynn, tu m'as annoncé," you announced. I did. Do you know what I mean? And we astrologers, because when people come to us, they're in a state of real openness and eagerness about, and we do this all the time, so we forget sometimes how extraordinary that space is that opens up between a consulting astrologer and a person who comes, and just how delicate almost every word can be, and the effect that you can say, well, you will never, or that's never going to happen. If you do that, you close off a person's hope. Even if they reject what you say, very often they will remember the one slip you made of the tongue. And so it's very, very important in that moment to measure language. And someone once told me that learning 2 languages, knowing more than one language, enables you to see the world with different viewpoints. And I found that to be really important living in more than one culture.
Mon père m'avisait.
Mon père m'avisait, exactement. Here in New Orleans, they speak.
Exactly. What I said is that my father said the same thing, that learning an extra language doubles your appreciation of life. Yeah. And you also, Steve, had been known to give people hope despite grave astrological signs in their lives. You know, I think I've read that you told someone that it looks good, but you can evaporate that good thing in a moment of bad judgment.
Yes, yes.
And yet you can then perhaps regain it, like Robert Downey did, and others have.
Yes.
So in astrology, are there second and third chances?
Absolutely. As far as I'm concerned, there are. It's one of the great schisms in the modern astrological community is between the determinists who feel that we can foresee the future in fairly rigid terms by looking at what's going on in somebody's chart, and the ones who believe, as I do, that consciousness interacts unpredictably with the astrological questions, that it is your fate to face certain questions in a given moment, and you cannot escape that fate. But like any good question, there's more than one answer to it. Energy can be neither created nor destroyed, only changed in form. The most basic principle of physics, and it applies to astrology too. Consciousness changes the form of the manifestation through choices that we make. That's my viewpoint.
So through astrology, if you've made some bad choices, can you help somebody get back on a path?
Absolutely. I've often done it. It gives meaning to my life. You can see the darkest kind of astrological event coming up, a heavy Saturn transit or something, that the fortune tellers would put the fear of God in you about it. But if you, with discipline and clear intentions, you can use that energy and lift yourself out of poverty or addiction or a bad relationship. It's time to climb the mountain, and my task is to define the mountain for the person as best I can, help them have the courage to climb it.
And with you, Lynn, what would your message be?
To a client who's in difficult circumstances or has made some bad choices, or choices they regret, let's say, whether they're, again, you know, it often depends on what point in your life you are. I would say to people that it's almost coming to a place where they have choice. The more they understand what's happened to them, the more they understand how they participate in what's happened to them. Even if they participated 12 years ago or 15 years ago, the more they understand the opening that's there. Because sometimes you make choices that close you in for a while. Oh, now I've got to live this out for 7 years, let's say. And that really does happen. But there, within that, as Stephen says, there's that moment where everything can change because you're no longer looking at it from the same place. And that's often what we're asked to do with things we can't change, as Stephen said. But I agree absolutely with what Stephen said, that we as astrologers bring to people this place where you're right on the opening of what's emerging in your life.
So it's a reading of patterns that may have been repeated for a long time, but you can help them find openings that give them a chance to break those patterns?
Oh, definitely. I think that one of the things that happens, recently a client of mine said something wonderful to me in a session. She said, well, Lynn, when I come to see you, it's like I have the feeling that internally everything becomes fluid again. It's like all the stuck places get unstuck, and I can feel the flow of my life in motion. And that was that was a beautiful compliment. And of course, every person experiences a session differently, and every person comes at a different moment and they might be looking for something they don't get, but they often get something they hadn't imagined was possible.
I'm Art Harris in New Orleans. I want to thank Lynn and Steve for an amazing few minutes here. Thank you. Thank you.
Wonderful to meet you.
You too. Great.